Hi, I'm Margaret Lorenz, and welcome to Counselors in the Car Getting Coffee.
You got it right this time. That was good. Good. And I'm Gordon Gooding. We are two Long Island-based therapists here on Long Island. That's a little redundant. And we're on our way to go get some coffee, and we're going to talk a little bit about trauma today. And we do have a special guest in the car.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Kathleen Hurley. I am also a Long Island therapist who practices on Long Island. And our practice is located in Garden City. We specialize in all types of evaluations. We also offer therapy services as well.
So,
what's the name of the practice?
We'll name the practice, though. We need to know that.
Psychological Diagnostic Evaluations of New York.
And they are fantastic. We've referred a lot of people to you, so we're glad to have you. And, you know, Margaret and I are not doctors, so we're not quite as cool as you.
No.
But
I am so excited to be on an episode of Counselors in the Car Getting Coffee.
Well,
that is the highlight of my day.
Well, you know what? And you're our first guest, so we're very excited about that too. So thank you for being here, Kathleen.
Thanks for having me, Gordon and Margaret.
So we thought we would talk about trauma today because one of the shorts that we put up that got the most traction had to do with people wondering if their trauma was bad enough for therapy. And I've had clients who
all the time
have told me that they worry that their trauma is bad enough, or they're making a big deal about it, and they don't know whether they deserve therapy. So we thought that would be a good place to start today.
I think that could happen with clients of all different ages, right? Kids, adolescents, adults, it doesn't really matter. That feeling could happen regardless of the age.
Mine can't be as bad because there's always a worse story, right?
Yes.
There's always somebody's story is always worse. So that's our instant thing to compare ourselves.
Right. And while that can be a helpful technique sometimes, right, to say, oh, well, it's not as bad, so I feel better, it also can be extremely invalidating for yourself to say, my trauma isn't as bad as X, therefore it doesn't matter, or it's not traumatic.
Do you think it's harder than to reach? I think it's harder than to reach out for help because you invalidate yourself, and it's like, oh, I'm making too big a deal. I should just handle this on my own. That's what I'm saying.
It gives you, going to treatment, we always think we're unique and nobody's going to understand. And when we start setting up scenarios in our head, like, my trauma's not bad enough, or I shouldn't feel this way because so-and-so has it worse, we just keep ourselves in that sense of isolation, which keeps us from getting the help we want, really.
Right.
And it also impacts your body too. So it's like not only do you feel it emotionally, but like physiologically you're going to feel the trauma too by keeping it in. So you may have like physical symptoms that you're not even realizing necessarily are related to the trauma.
I love that you brought that up.
Yes.
Now Kathleen is also going to be a neuropsych.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because being a doctor, it's not enough. We're going to be a super doctor.
Overachiever.
But she's awesome. We still love her. So, but maybe can you speak to that a little bit? Because I don't know. Some people don't. I always tell people when we keep stress in our bodies, they're always surprised to me. People, my clients are always like, "What do you mean? It's really not in our body. It's all mental and so." But it's really not, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the, kind of main people and researchers on trauma is Bessel van der Kolk, right? And he talks about, he has this famous book where it's called The Body Keeps Score. And I think regardless of whatever you're practicing, understanding that trauma is in our body and in our brains is really, really important to understand. It impacts us on every level. And so trauma, I think, initially starts with your perception, right? So your brain's understanding of what you're experiencing. And from there, it impacts everything following. And I'm sure we see that in all of our sessions of people's understanding of events can be traumatic. That initially leads to the trauma.
And our body reacts to it. Our blood actually, our pupils can dilate more. Our blood pumps a little bit harder.
Yep, we
our
start
arteries.
sweating.
Yeah. It's like this really physical reaction to it, even if you're not in any immediate danger. It's the perception of trauma, right? That goes on.
Yeah. And initially that response is helpful, right? It keeps us safe
100%.
in that particular trauma. So we're able to react quicker, we're able to think faster, our adrenaline's pumping. So initially that's really helpful, but we don't want to stay in that state for long. That's when it becomes like a maladaptive response.
And what I was going to say too is I don't think people sometimes, when they're minimizing their trauma, they don't always, like when their body's reacting, we have to pay attention to that.
Yes.
Right? People think, well, I'm everything's fine. I'm just getting sweaty. I'm just like, I'm having my heart is racing for no reason, but really it could be something bigger than that. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Are there any smaller reactions that the body might have that people sweep under the rug or don't like immediately notice?
Well, I think it's just if you're immediately kind of discrediting yourself, right? That initial, like what we just talked about, like it's not that big of a deal, or it's not as big of a problem. And so I think that is like our first key is like awareness, right? Of like, how do I actually feel, and like validating that feeling as real and true to yourself. And then, noticing, do you have any physiological reactions to it? Was my stomach hurting? Is my head hurting more? Of course, I would always advise my clients to go get a full physical evaluation to make sure that there's nothing medical underlying. That's a big part too.
Well, because the gut and the gut and the brain are so intimately, I'm so fascinated by that.
All of our receptors are in our gut.
Yeah.
Yep. So when we take medications and things like that, that's why sometimes eating is important. It's all of our feeling receptors are in our gut.
Yeah. The gut is the second brain.
Yeah.
The gut is the second brain.
Yes.
It's a fascinating thing, though, because you always think butterflies in the stomach.
Yeah,
right? Everyone
right.
always thinks that, but there's actually some science behind that. It's not just butterflies. It's actually something really neurological and chemical, right?
Absolutely.
Well,
Dr. Hurley took my questions that I had.
She did.
She took the paper.
Well, we want to get some coffee because we are counselors in the car
Getting coffee.
Even though somebody gets tea. Do you get coffee?
I get coffee.
All right.
It's counselors in the car getting coffee. You have to get coffee.
Right, that's it. I love that. All right. Well, so we'll take a little break, get some coffee, and we're going to come back with some more questions.
Coffee. Yeah.
And coffee. We went very high end today.
Sponsor us.
Well, they're gonna. They haven't found us yet, but I'm pretty sure.
Any day.
And then James Corden's gonna come on.
Yup.
And we're all gonna.
And then we're gonna get sued
by Jerry Seinfeld. And
That'll
everybody's
be
gonna watch
exciting.
us. We can't wait to get the cease and desist from Jerry.
It's gonna
right?
be the best.
It's gonna be awesome.
Okay.
All right. So, continuing our conversation with trauma. What do we have next for Kathleen?
I have.
Put her in the hot seat.
What makes something traumatic as opposed to a bad event? What turns it into trauma?
So we were talking before about your perception, right? And I think that is a key part, is what you perceive as to be really difficult, but also like changes your perception of things, changes your understanding. Bad events, right, are bad in nature, but you can kind of move past them with some degree of coping.
Right.
But a trauma really stays with you. It stays in your body. It stays within you, and it really bleeds into kind of every aspect of your life.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to acknowledge because it's different for everyone. So, I've had clients who've had something happen in their life. Maybe friends abandoned them when they were in middle school, and it was really hard for them to move past. And they'd look at other friends or family members who had the same type of thing happen and be like, well, it didn't bother them. Why is it bothering me? There's something wrong with me.
All the time people say that.
Yeah.
Well, so-and-so, they got over their boyfriend or girl, whatever, real no problem. Now I'm still... years later, mourning over this loss of relationship.
And sometimes I see it too with even parents and children. They can experience similar things, and it's, like, well, why can she get over it? Or why can't they move on? And it really depends on the person. And validating that this is real for them and that it's okay to feel how they feel and work on it at the same time.
Yeah.
My pet peeve is I shouldn't feel this way. It drives me insane.
It's not that bad, right?
Yes,
It
I shouldn't feel this way. Yeah. And it's like, no, everyone has got their own experience based on their family background, based on prior events of why something would impact me different than would impact the two of you, right?
Yeah.
You know what I tell people when they say those things to me is like, you're kind of gaslighting yourself.
Yes.
You're
That's
telling
a good way
yourself.
of putting it. I like that.
Yeah.
That you're making it harder for yourself, not easier. How's that working for you?
I would say don't shit all over yourself.
Yeah.
This is my good dad joke pun,
You do say that.
You're shitting all over
Don't
you.
shit all over yourself.
You do say that. And I do think parents can also do the same thing where it's almost like, well, why are you getting upset about this? This is no big deal. This is something that happens to everybody. And I've sometimes been guilty of that. But, your kid you might feel like your kid is an extension of you, but they're not. They're having their own experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what about social media? What's your guys' take on that? Is it, when in terms of a trauma, like I've seen how that can, sometimes it validates it. I've seen people say like, I didn't know anyone else feels this way, but I also see people go, well, I shouldn't feel this way because this, that, and the other thing.
Or the idea of I should just, say something to myself or do some affirmations and be past it. That kind of like toxic positivity idea.
Right, and I think
yeah.
you could use it in many different ways, right? I mean, in some ways it's in our hands all the time, right? So it's like the first thing we go to, or when we're having a thought or an experience, our phones are in our hand. And so, we're just kind of scrolling. A lot of the time I see it numbs our feelings, right? Where we're not processing, we're not feeling our feelings if we're looking behind a screen. But then if what we're looking at, right, like you're saying, is social media, sometimes it can be positive. Margaret, I totally agree. I think you can find easy access to coping and positive affirmations, and it can be really advantageous. But I also think it could be a further source of pain where you're comparing, oh, look, they've moved on, they're happy, they're in a relationship. And
no, that's really what I meant. That sometimes it gets to be too simplistic. If I just do this affirmation, or if I just, interact on Reddit, I'll feel better. I don't need to see anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't take the place of real support.
Well, it's different. Commenting or reading comment and actually sitting and getting coffee with somebody.
Right. It's not engaging.
You like that transition?
I know that was a good one.
But it is the face-to-face. There's some real value in healing properties. I would say connection is a very healing thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because you're engaging with people on social media, but it really is like a different form of engagement.
It's not like you can't really read their faces, and body language is so much of how we communicate, right?
Right. It's nonverbal communication is such a big part of, you can't see someone's facial expressions, you can't read their tone, and I think that could really, if you're going in vulnerable, that could make things significantly harder for you.
100%. I think that's what was hard about the pandemic too. Everyone's behind masks and screens, and we're on this mental health crisis. I don't want to overanalyze it, but I think it's definitely a contributing factor of that human connection we all need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, on some level, it's like a global trauma that everybody went through. And I think, and I still think that we perceive things differently, because being back in school, I can see that a lot of educators and parents are like, well, just come on, let's get going. Let's just get back to normal. And certain people aren't there yet.
Right. And I think, Margaret, that brings up a really great point of like, a healing is a process. It's not, oh, the pandemic is over, therefore your trauma is over. Or so-and-so has moved on, therefore you should be, move on. It's a process, and it's okay to take as long as it takes.
I see that with our clients. Some people have bounced back from the pandemic and being isolated for so long, and some people are still having a hard time, whether they're still afraid of COVID or they're just, haven't used that social muscle now, that they're kind of still isolating a little bit, right?
Yeah, and I'll say, like, eyes on your own paper. Don't look at the person next to you and imagine like they're doing great. You don't really know what they're going through. Just eyes on your paper, eyes on what you're doing. Be supportive of your friends, but don't judge yourself.
I like that. Eyes on your own paper.
Yeah,
that's good.
That's a good one. Might steal that. I'll give you credit though, Margaret.
Get a little hashtag Margaret Lorenz.
I do actually tell people that I say don't shit on yourself, but I get that from you.
So don't shit on yourself, but don't shit on yourself.
Should. I said
You shouldn't shit on yourself either.
Neither
both
of those
things would be appropriate.
Neither of those things. Should on yourself.
We have to pronunciate very
clearly.
On
don't should and don't shit on yourself. There we go. Both things be bad. For
so
funny.
I had another question.
How about anything else with the kids you see with the social media and how they
Social media can be
especially
a
with
trauma,
you know?
in and of itself. Yeah, because so many kids have access to unfettered phone, unfettered internet, or there's parental things in place, but the kid can get around them, and you can see some pretty traumatic things on the computer now.
Yeah. And some of it too. I mean, there's the traumatic things, and then there's the, I guess in trauma they always talk about big T and little t, right? Mm-hmm. So there's obviously the big things where you can see horrible sexual exploitation and violence and all that kind of thing, but you also can just that idea of certain kids being so left out, right? That can be a smaller trauma, but that's still,
and I think one of the kind of side effects of trauma is isolation. And so you now have someone, regardless of their age, right, feeling isolated, and then they go on in their hands at any point in the day and see people connecting, people laughing, people smiling, people looking pretty. Like, that further isolates their feelings about themselves.
Which adds kind of like that other layer of trauma.
Absolutely.
Right? Again.
Or even those, when I was a kid, your friends could get together without you and you'd never know. Now, so many people, adults and kids, see, we had a party and all these people are here and you're not. That's
what happens all the time. I think the kids feel it.
And then it repeatedly happens, right? It's not just that one time. So it is like a repeated exposure to...
Over and over and over again. While you're home by yourself with a device in your hand.
Right, you can watch it unfold.
Everybody's out, the whole world's having fun except for,
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, Margaret, that goes to your point earlier of like, maybe multiple bad events are traumatic, right?
Yeah.
Like they could be one and the same. If you have repeated experiences of the same thing, that could feel traumatic.
Yes, because if you feel like you're repeatedly, I've had a lot of people say to me that they've been left out a number of times, and then they own that as a fault of theirs. And we can't identify what that would be. I'm the only common denominator. And maybe it's the...
So before we wrap up, because it's almost time for us to get back, to have our coffee breaks over.
Yeah.
Any advice of if someone's looking for help with trauma, like what tools are there? In our practice, we do a lot of EMDR work, which I think is a great tool for especially for traumatic events. But any advice of what you guys, where do you start with somebody if they feel like it's trauma, but they're like, but it's really not trauma. I'm just overreacting. I'm being,
I think, it's such an overused term, but like self-care, now that we understand trauma is focus in the body, right? Like, especially as the weather's changing, getting out, going for a walk, connecting with nature, free things, right? Movement, those things I would say are very healing. Of course, in addition to, a structured therapy session.
100%. But I think that being outside, I always say
being outside,
being around people, the more isolated we are, the more impactful that trauma can be on us.
Yeah, absolutely. And doing that opposite action where I want to stay and I want to just be by myself, but knowing that's not right for you and kind of pushing yourself out, getting past your own entropy and getting out in the world can make a huge difference.
Do the opposite.
Do the opposite.
Do the opposite.
Yeah.
Of what you're feeling too.
Focus on recovery all the time.
Yeah.
If you don't want to go out, go out.
Yeah. Opposite action.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Very good. So before we wrap up, where can we find you?
You
Besides
can find
in the back
us.
seat of my truck.
Yes.
From time to time.
Hopefully, you'll find me on future episodes of
I hope
Counselors
so.
in the Car
Yes.
Getting Coffee. We are on Instagram, on Facebook, and on the World Wide Web.
On the World Wide Web. We'll put
World
links
Wide Web.
in the description box below of all of Kathleen's Instagram, Facebook, World Wide Web stuff.
Great.
And we actually have a couple of blogs on trauma. I think we should put in our comments too.
Yeah.
But maybe next time we could do something on complex trauma too.
Sure.
We didn't really touch on that, but I think that's a really
And if it's not trauma, what is it? So there's a lot of techniques we could talk about evaluations to look at what is it? Is it trauma? Is it attention disorders? Like what is it if it's not trauma?
I like that.
Okay.
So you'll come back.
I would love to.
That's awesome.
I would
She'll
love
come
to.
back. She said she'd come back.
Thank you, Gordon and Margaret, for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Okay.
Okay.
Again, check us out on goodingwellness.com and rate, review, subscribe.
Hit the subscribe bell. Leave us a comment below, and see you next week. Bye.